So today's safety connection is on No Jokes About Safety, How to Identify Real versus Fake PPE. My name is Luca Romano. I'm a health and safety consultant specializing in occupational hygiene with workplace safety and prevention services. Okay, so it's 10:30. We're going to jump right into this. So just overall, to start off, we have a demographics survey that hopefully everybody can participate in. So this is being provided by the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development. It's a demographic survey. So if you wouldn't mind, if you could scan the QR code that you see on the screen or click the link that's shown on the screen, or even there should be a link that's provided in the chat as well. If you wouldn't mind filling this out, that would be really appreciated. The function number or the code that you're going to need to, I guess, provide within the survey is 232591. For the most part, this information will be kept secure and anonymous, and none of your personal information will be saved. This information is being analyzed in an aggregated form as well. And again, it's just to collect demographics for the most part. So I'll give everybody a couple of minutes just to kind of do this. And yeah, if everything is good, just give me a thumbs up when you're done or what have you. And we'll just kind of move it along. Okay, it looks like a couple people have gotten it done, so we'll just move it along. Okay, so before we just jump into the session, just some housekeeping items I want to talk about. So for the most part, computer audio is what's recommended for today's session. Your microphone will remain muted throughout the duration of the presentation, as well as your camera being off for the presentation as well. If there's any issues overall, just for the most part, use the chat and I'll try to respond to questions or issues as we go along. In general, I hope that everyone's familiar with Microsoft Teams for the most part. The top ribbon at the top is kind of the main area where you can control stuff. You can react in real time as I'm speaking, and I see that a lot of people are aware of how to use that feature, which is excellent because it provides me good feedback. In terms of polls, there won't be any polls today. Everything that we're going to be kind of interacting with will be through the chat. So I'll be monitoring that, and just be aware that the chat is public. So just, again, be mindful of kind of the language or the things that you're inputting in there for the most part. If for accessibility reasons you need to have live captions, you can click the More icon and then select Language and Speech, and you can actually turn on real-time captions. If you want to change the way that the presentation is being displayed, if you click the little view icon, it looks like a little square. If you click that, you can select full screen mode as needed, and yeah, just be aware of those features as well. So I hope everyone here has had the chance to attend a safety connection before, but maybe for those that haven't, I'll just kind of give a quick introduction. So really, they exist to provide information on a diverse range of health and safety topics, and really allows us to connect with our industry peers, facilitate best practice and knowledge exchange. And all of this can be done from the convenience of your personal workspace, which I think is a really important thing too, because at the end of the day, it can cross barriers from, maybe we are in more remote parts of Ontario or Canada. And again, it's always good to be provided information on different topics. So yeah, so we'll jump into the presentation now. So it's on No Jokes About Safety, How to Identify Real versus Fake Personal Protective Equipment. To start off, we'll cover a little bit of the agenda for today. The hope is that, in terms of some of the more important skills, there's awareness provided to the hazards of fake or counterfeit or even non-certified personal protective equipment. Hopefully you'll be able to understand different types of PPE certifications and approvals, and kind of a little bit about how that process kind of works in Ontario and Canada more broadly. We'll also look at red flags that you can use to identify when you're sourcing personal protective equipment. And then we'll also hope to provide you some tips and best practices when you're sourcing and verifying this PPE. Now, the scope of this problem, this is not a theoretical issue. This is a problem that is happening in Canada and in Ontario, and to be honest, in the world around us as well. The Canada Border Services Agency, as well as Health Canada, they routinely intercept counterfeit and non-compliant personal protective equipment. This tells us that fake PPE is actively attempting to enter the Canadian marketplace. And, just based on the law of averages, there might be some proportion of this fake PPE that is actually entering the workplace. So it could be entering from, ports of entry or what have you, but it's also possible that it's actually being manufactured domestically here in Canada in terms of, again, where it's coming from. Now, real world impact. So we got to think about what PPE is used for, right? So personal protective equipment. It's often used as a measure to help safeguard workers. This is especially important in high risk industries. But what happens is if you have something that you're using to protect yourself and it's not providing that level of protection it's supposed to be engineered to, it can lead to some very negative consequences. It can lead to injury, it can lead to illness, it can lead to exposures. And if we also think about it on the flip side of the coin, there's investments that are being made into this equipment, and we can suffer financial losses as a result. So it can lead to, obviously directly the personal protective equipment might not be providing the I guess monetary value that we've invested. But then when we have an incident or we have an injury or something around that, it can lead to maybe operational disruptions. It can lead to lost time. It can lead to lots of different types of consequences. So it is an important topic for the most part, and it can have real world impact. So to maybe get a better gauge on kind of maybe the scope of the problem, I'm kind of curious to see if anybody in the room here has ever encountered counterfeit personal protective equipment. So if you have a second, if you wouldn't mind just maybe, adding your comments in the chat, that would be great. In terms of the image I have on the screen, this is actually a real world example of a counterfeit that was actually encountered at a facility, right? And it's showing a full face piece respirator. Again, it's just the packaging, it's the box on the outside. But this was encountered during a training session. And for the most part, respirator is an important type of thing in the workplace. But yeah, it's a good thing we caught this early before we, this was put into use. So I'm seeing some comments. Safety glasses bought on Amazon. I mean, that's a good example. Safety glasses that have a fake CSA or ANSI code on them. Yep. Purchased from overseas, less expensive. Yep. Another comment here is during COVID, lots of masks claiming N95, KN95 when they were not. That's another great example. The interesting thing is, at the core of what we talk about today, although it's specific to personal protective equipment, a lot of these different, I guess, techniques or controls can apply to other types of counterfeit materials as well. So I think it's an important skill to have in our world. And really, we're going to talk a lot about risk factors. So it's about kind of doing more due diligence before we purchase things and making sure that things are the things they're supposed to be. I see another comment here. When I worked in healthcare, we were provided some PPE from the provincial portal that we identified as counterfeit. It was an off-brand N95. Yes, another genuine example. Another example here, a safety harness come in for inspection that was not CSA, bought from Amazon. Yes, you have to be careful. Sometimes too, I find that when you're purchasing things, if it's a marketplace seller versus being directly sold by a certain brand name, that can also impact maybe the vetting and the importance of vetting as well. So, okay, this is great. This is great. So based on anecdotal responses that have been provided, we can see that there have been experiences with this as a problem in Canada and in Ontario. So we're going to kind of look at different lenses. We're going to start off looking at, due diligence and employer responsibility when it comes to counterfeit or fake personal protective equipment. So we're going to start off by kind of looking at some of the legislation and maybe how it relates to fake PPE as a hazard. So I hope everyone's aware of the general duty clause, or section 25(2)(h) of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, basically this states that, the employer has to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstance for the protection of a worker. This is often referred to as the due diligence clause. If we look at this, we would anticipate that this duty or requirement is broad, and necessarily it should be proactive. And really it could apply to a variety of different hazards, whether they're obvious or even hidden. And we could infer this with even counterfeit PPE. Some other requirements found under the Occupational Health and Safety Act that kind of relate to this topic include providing and ensuring the use of equipment, materials, and protective devices, ensuring that the equipment, materials, and protective devices provided by the employer are maintained in good condition, and that any personal protective clothing and equipment that are provided are worn or used in a proper fit and are appropriate in the circumstance, having regard to all relevant factors. So really, if we were to kind of look at these and kind of gain some meaning from them, what we could kind of infer is that if PPE is counterfeit or not certified, or it's not rated against the protection it needs to for the type of hazard, then we might not be meeting our due diligence requirements, even if we're purchasing this equipment in good faith. Another important thing to note is that, as much as on face value, we might look at this as a procurement problem, it's not just a procurement problem. It is actually also a due diligence issue. And we have to also remember that due diligence is not just about your intent or your cost savings. It's about the actions that you're putting into place. It's, part of it is documentation we have, but then it's the processes we have in place. It's the things we make living and breathing in our workplace. And at the end of the day, it's assessed on whether reasonable proactive steps were taken by an employer to prevent foreseeable risks. Because we're aware that counterfeit PPE is a known and documented issue within Canada, we need to take action on this and make sure that we have some type of measures in place to manage through this risk or hazard. I would also say that because we're aware of other types of counterfeit products that exist in our world, I would say that the standard should be different, and we should be asking this question for personal protective equipment. At the end of the day, employers should be expected to be aware that, again, counterfeit personal protective equipment exists, and that reasonable steps need to be taken to authenticate the personal protective equipment that we're purchasing and that we even put into place. If we fail to verify this, it could be seen potentially as a control failure. Really, at the root of it, the question we should be asking is not, did we know if it was counterfeit, but what do we do to make sure that it isn't, or that it wasn't for the most part? So what would due diligence in practice look like from a counterfeit PPE lens? So again, if we look at it, due diligence, again, taking every precaution reasonable in the circumstance, it's demonstrated through systems and not assumptions. So we need to make sure we have layers and processes in place, that we're identifying hazards, that we're taking, controls, and we're looking at the hierarchy of controls, and that if situations arise, we're correcting and preventing these risks from happening again, especially if they are foreseeable. When we also apply this to counterfeit personal protective equipment from a due diligence lens, some of the things that we need to consider are, how do we verify whether our personal protective equipment is actually the right type, but then that it's actually compliant, that it's actually, meeting standards that are required? How are we purchasing this material, and are we actually doing some type of vetting process, and what type of due diligence systems are in place both on the supplier and for us to actually verify the suppliers themselves? How are we actually inspecting the personal protective equipment, both from, a frontline worker use standpoint, but then even before it gets to the worker? How are we vetting it before we're actually issuing it? In general, all of these topics will be discussed in subsequent slides. And I'm hoping that you get some good information and tips overall on how to manage through these different types of subjects. Now we'll look at how to we will introduce counterfeit PPE. We'll also look at certification and different standards that exist in Ontario and Canada more broadly. So, common types of counterfeit or fake PPE. So oftentimes, the personal protective equipment that is, I guess, counterfeited the most would be stuff that's in high demand, that's often used in I guess, most industries, as well as those that are maybe more often on the lower cost side of things. The other thing too is that, it can include some of the items that I've listed here, but it could also include a variety of others. I've listed these as they're often the most targeted or often the most frequently used in a variety of workplaces. So this can include things like head protection, respirators, hearing protection, eye and face protection, high visibility apparel, gloves, and even footwear. I would say that for those that participated in the chat, I think that most of these have been covered off in terms of things that people have experienced. Okay. Now, in order to know if something is, I guess, fake or non-genuine or counterfeit, we have to start off looking at how do we know if something is actually compliant when it comes to personal protective equipment? What does this actually mean? So we start off with legislation or laws that exist in Ontario. So at the end of the day, personal protective equipment can only be compliant if it meets the requirements of both the Occupational Health and Safety Act and relevant regulations that are associated with, I guess, the subject or the task that's being performed. It should never be just because a supplier says it's approved or industrial or meets standards, especially if there isn't any documentation or performance data that can actually, support these claims. If personal protective equipment does not actually protect the worker from the hazard, it will never be compliant, regardless of how it might be labeled. So really, it's about performance and suitability and not just based on the way the personal protective equipment looks or even claims that are made. At the end of the day, we have to start off with the personal protective equipment matching the level of risk. Personal protective equipment should never be selected in isolation. Really, when you have a hazard or some type of risk that's involved with work that people are doing, it should follow the process. It should follow the process that's related to the work. What do I mean by that? Well, it's really the cradle to grave. It's breaking stuff into tasks and identifying risks and hazards at every layer to that task or hazard overall. And really, it starts off with a broad risk assessment and then maybe honing in a little bit more specifically. But it should be specific to the type and level of risk that's in place. And we should also be considering controls, from the hierarchy of controls to start off. We start off looking at, can we eliminate the hazard? Can we substitute? Can we implement engineering controls? Can we implement administrative controls? Personal protective equipment should always be the last line of defense. And oftentimes we need to implement it to supplement other controls that we have in place. But it also needs to be specific to the hazards and level of risk that are present. A simple example, let's say you were in a workplace that's like an office environment. If we did a risk assessment and, we didn't need to wear respirators, then we shouldn't be sourcing those if we don't need them. Likewise, if we were in a different situation where we're in a chemical manufacturing environment and, if let's say during an emergency situation we need respirators, then obviously, based on the level of risk, we would make sure that we have suitable respirators that are used in that type of scenario. At the end of the day, if personal protective equipment doesn't control the identified hazard, it won't be compliant, even if it meets a standard on paper. So, as an example, let's say I'm working with something like hydrochloric acid, and I have impact-resistant gloves that I'm using. Although it's rated to a certain standard, it's not going to be protective against the specific nature of hazard that I have. I would need some type of chemical resistant glove that is appropriate for hydrochloric acid. On the opposite end of it, if I went and I purchased, I guess, gloves from a dollar store, let's say, and those weren't, I guess, matched to any type of standard, and I was using it for hydrochloric acid, that also wouldn't be protective, and that probably wouldn't comply with different types of personal protective equipment standards. In general, requirements for personal protective equipment can be found in legislation and laws. So more broadly, the Occupational Health and Safety Act might have different requirements, but more specifics can be found in sector-specific regulations. And again, this is dependent on the industry you work in or the types of processes you have in place. Some examples that are shown here. So we have Regulation 833, the control of exposure to biological or chemical agents. This might apply to a lot of different types of workplaces. An example of where a standard might be specified could be, specifics towards respirators. So in Ontario specifically, respirators at a minimum should meet NIOSH standards or an equivalent to NIOSH. Another example could be, Regulation 213, construction projects. There might be standards specific in there that require fall arrest or fall protection equipment, meeting certain types of standards as well. In general, specific standards that are referenced within regulations or laws, they do become legally enforceable. So it is important to identify this as well. Another thing that I want to make sure that I clarify and that is important is there is a difference between testing and certification when it comes to personal protective equipment. So when we talk about testing, it's the product itself, the PPE, is being evaluated against a specific type of performance criteria. It might be conducted by a laboratory that hopefully is accredited. Sometimes they might not be accredited, which again, there might be some risk involved with that. But really, the testing that's done might only apply to a certain parameter. It won't be necessarily as rigorous as a certification, where when you have certification, there might be multiple types of testing that are conducted, and there might be some type of documentation and certification marking that is provided after that. So I kind of mentioned this right now, but certification for the most part is obviously different, and it often involves a formal process, and it's usually conducted by a recognized certification body. And what they do is, for the most part, they're making sure that a whole bunch of different requirements are being met based on applicable standards. Oftentimes, these types of materials are manufactured under controlled quality systems, and oftentimes they're ongoing. There's ongoing oversight or audits that take place. Again, the way I distinguish the two is that certification probably involves multiple different types of checks and balances and multiple tests. Testing will only show how a sample performed once in a specific type of, limelight for the most part. And oftentimes, certification will also show that the product is actually approved for ongoing use. So I hope everybody is pretty well familiar with different certification bodies and standards, but if you're not, we're going to kind of talk on some of the more common ones. We'll start off with CSA Group. So CSA develops Canadian national standards, and they're the primary reference body for personal protective equipment within Ontario. Oftentimes, CSA standards are referenced in various Ontario regulations, and where the standards aren't referenced, they may be seen as the default performance best practice benchmark for the most part. Some examples are shown here. So we'll talk a little bit more in depth about each of these later on. I'm not going to read all the specific numbers and what have you, but really from head protection all the way to footwear, there are different types of CSA standards that exist. Now, there's also NIOSH, or the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. They're actually an American federal agency, and they test and approve respirators. So in general, within Ontario, we talked earlier about Regulation 833. At a minimum, respirators should meet the standards that are afforded by NIOSH. The only exception would be if there is a certifying body that has, standards in place that are equivalent to NIOSH, if not exceed them. The other thing that's important to note too is that at the end of the day, whether it's NIOSH or a different type of, standard body that's approving these respirators, they do have to meet the performance requirements that are found in legislation in Ontario. But to be honest, NIOSH is seen as the gold standard for the most part. The other thing is that there are, I guess, lots of other types of standards that exist in the world when it comes to personal protective equipment. We're not going to cover each of those in depth, but for the most part, I put some of the more common ones that you might encounter. So you might encounter ANSI standards or American National Standards Institute standards. You might also encounter standards from the European Union, so CE standards, EN standards. These standards on their own might not be accepted, but they might complement existing CSA standards, or they might be seen as a best practice in the absence of a CSA standard or an NIOSH standard. At the end of the day, employers still have to show that the personal protective equipment is appropriate, effective, and reasonable under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Okay, so now we're going to jump into how we can identify red flags as they relate to counterfeit and fake personal protective equipment. So we're going to start off more broadly. In general, we'll start off with common red flags that I would say are good leading indicators for a multitude of different types of personal protective equipment, and then we'll get more specific into, different types of PPE. So to start off, simple red flag would be that the documentation of the certification or the markings themselves are missing, vague, or even incorrect. So again, that's something that can apply across the board with, again, a variety of different types of PPE. The packaging might look off or it might lack traceability. So let's say you're used to a certain brand that you buy from. If you're noticing that something's off with the packaging itself, or you can't actually trace back where the package came from in terms of the supplier or even the manufacturer, those are important red flags. Sometimes too, you could have too good to be true pricing or availability. So these limited time deals, you have 500,000 units that are suddenly available for 1 cent each. If it's too good to be true, chances are that they are. I want to also say that these are leading indicators. So what it means is on their own, these might not all be definitive, I guess, hallmarks that something is fake, but it gives you a heads up that you need to do more vetting and or take more steps in terms of checking up on things. It could also be the wrong design for the intended protection. So let's say you're buying a certain type of brand of material and they send you something that's rated against a different standard and it's not meeting what you need. That's a simple one as well sometimes. Poor materials or build quality, so it's flimsy, it's paper thin, it's brittle, it's breaking, it's not meeting the durability that you would expect. The components don't match up or they're not compatible, so you're given all these different pieces and you're trying to configure them together and they're just not mixing and matching the way that they should be. They're just made out of poor quality or what have you. They're missing or have invalid approval numbers. So when it comes to different, I guess, personal protective equipment, oftentimes there can be approval numbers that are issued, but sometimes too, when you match serial numbers from manufacturers, you can find that these don't match up. And again, that can be a red flag. Performance that doesn't match the expectations. So, you're using it and things are falling apart, or, you're having problems associated with it. Urgent availability. So suddenly there's this limited time deal and, we suddenly have 100,000 units available and I'm offering this to you, please buy this. Spelling errors or poor print quality. Again, that kind of relates to the packaging sometimes, but sometimes on the equipment itself, you might notice that, the devices that have spelling errors or the printing of the actual packaging that it comes in is off or it's brittle or what have you. Sometimes too, you can have inconsistent branding or even packaging. So this relates to, again, the manufacturers themselves and especially if it's a brand name manufacturer, there's something there that just doesn't look consistent and it's giving you that hesitation for the most part. Okay, so now we'll talk about some red flags when it comes to head protection. To start off, one thing that is characteristic would be if you look at the inside of the actual helmet or other type of device, there should be some type of CSA marking within it, especially if it is personal protective equipment. Sometimes too, you might find that it's cracked or discolored when you're purchasing it. Those are red flags. At the end of the day, it should meet a certain level of durability and quality. Likewise, there shouldn't be any holes or anything wrong with the actual shell of the head protection or helmet. There should also be some type of date stamp of whether it was, manufactured at a certain date or even, if it's letting you know when it expires. The suspension within it as well should not be damaged, and it should meet certain, standards of quality and impact prevention and what have you. Then there's also, it might be rated at against a different type of standard other than CSA, or it might indicate that it's a lookalike or it's meeting industrial protection requirements. These can also be red flags. So tips for verifying head protection. So head protection should meet the requirements of CSA Z94.1, the standard. When you're verifying it, you can check the inside of the hard hat or even bump cap or other types of device. The hard hat must actually display a permanent legible marking that includes reference to the CSA standard, the type or class of device, as well as the manufacturer's name or logo and the date of manufacture. When it comes to respirators, oftentimes air purifying respirators are kind of the most common types that are counterfeited. So this can include things like disposable filtering facepiece respirators such as N95, N95s. It can also include half facepiece respirators or even full facepiece respirators. Oftentimes these are counterfeited because they're actually used quite often in workplaces. And oftentimes what can happen as well is that counterfeit products misuse existing approval numbers that exist for other types of equipment. So some red flags, especially when you have filtering facepiece respirators like N95s. To my knowledge and from my experience, I'm yet to have found a NIOSH approved N95 respirator that has ear loops. So sometimes that can be a leading indicator. There's no NIOSH documentation or even approval numbers associated with the actual respirator or a NIOSH equivalent, right? So if it's a body that's certifying it other than NIOSH, but it meets a similar standard of, I guess, rigorous testing, then, again, that can also apply in that case. The actual components are fake or even low quality. So as an example, to go back to my full face piece respirator example, in the case of when we were helping a client, we had a look at the respirator itself and the filters. And when we opened the filters, they didn't have anything really inside of them other than like a little paper thin membrane, which right away was a huge red flag. When you're verifying respiratory protective equipment, there are some ways to go about doing this. So I have some images here that are showing some examples of, NIOSH related certificates. So again, NIOSH tests and certifies respirators and their components. This includes cartridges, hoods, it's not just the respirator face pieces themselves. And what happens is when they actually test these devices and they've been approved, there's an approval number that actually is issued for these components. And you can actually take a look at these on NIOSH's certified equipment list website. So if you're interested, you can actually hopefully click this link and be able to, in real time actually take a look at this. What you can do is, once you have the actual approval number either on the respirator or component itself or the documentation that comes with it, you can compare the two and vet it to make sure that it is actually approved for, the actual, I guess, component or even respirator device itself. So just to clarify as well, not in all cases are engravings or stamps put on the actual device. So oftentimes this might be seen on an N95 as an example or other type of filtering facepiece respirator, but it doesn't always apply in every case. A simple example is a respirator cartridge. There may or may not be an engraving on it, but there will be paperwork that comes with the filter, similar to what you see on the screen here. And I'm not sure how well everybody can see it, but it will look at the approval numbers and show that, as an example, this half-face piece respirator has this approval number, and it's approved with these types of filter cartridges as well. So I kind of just talked about this, but the approval number is often a TC number with NIOSH equipment, and you can match that to the certified equipment list that they have. And yeah, it should be present with the packaging, as I mentioned. You should be cross-referencing and making sure that the exact model matches what you have in place and that you've actually received. What can happen sometimes is there will be, there'll be respirators that are, let's say fake, and they're using an actual approval number that actually matches a different brand of respirator. So we have to be careful of stuff like that. And this is, I think, a really good tool to help support that. Hearing protection. So hearing protection, sometimes what can happen is you can have noise reduction ratings that are unverified. So basically the packaging indicates that it can protect to, let's say, I don't know, 35 decibels, but there's no documentation or laboratory data that's been provided that supplements that claim. Oftentimes, fake hearing protection can be made of cheap quality. It can be very brittle. It might not fit people properly. It might not actually be able to be inserted appropriately. It can also be worn or damaged upon receipt, or even just from, I guess, use. It just breaks kind of more quickly than it should. Sometimes too, especially when you have earplugs, especially foam inserts, you're supposed to lift your ear up and then, you roll the foam insert and then you insert it, and then it's supposed to expand in your ear. If this isn't happening, that could be a red flag to say that maybe it's a counterfeit. Another important thing is that, sometimes recreational devices might be used as hearing protection, but we want to make sure that they're actually approved for use against a certain standard, right? Like at the end of the day, they have to be able to provide a certain level of protection that is important in terms of safeguarding workers. In general, I would stay away from using recreational devices as hearing protection unless you have some type of documentation that can prove that it is approved against specific standards that are compliant with Ontario requirements. And the other thing that's a little bit harder with hearing protection is that, unlike other types of PPE, there's not really a standard single mandatory marking that's required. Really, what you're going to need to kind of gauge or I guess focus on is whether the device is actually recognized, it's purpose designed, and it's not a consumer or recreational product. You should be taking a look at how it actually behaves and whether it's actually adequate in terms of its rating for the type of noise exposure. So, taking a look at the noise reduction rating or the equivalent level of protectiveness that it provides, and looking and cross-referencing it with manufacturer documentation. Do they have data or laboratory data to showcase that it's actually been tested and or, in some cases certified to actually protect at, different frequencies or levels of noise? So some type of performance data for the most part. When it comes to eye and face protection, some red flags can include no CSA marking. It could be eyewear that is, let's say, being marketed as safety eyewear, but it's actually just kind of regular eyewear that, again, can't actually protect against the hazard. Sometimes too, what can happen is, let's say, you're being sent some type of eye protection that you need for a certain hazard. Let's say the counterfeiter sends you a specific type that isn't rated for the hazard that you need. That can sometimes happen. Again, you can have damaged or scratched materials that are sent to you. They're brittle. They're not actually, providing the durability that they should. Maybe they've been provided and they actually can't fit workers, and they're not designed for, the right, I guess, standard of staff for the most part. Again, when it comes to standards, especially with eye protection, there's certain parameters of design that are required based on standards. And again, they can be certified maybe against other standards, but there's no CSA markings or there's no, equivalence to that in general. It's not compliant with Ontario requirements. So when your goal is to verify eye and face protection, there is a CSA standard that exists, and that is CSA standard Z94.3. What you can do when you're verifying is check for permanent markings on the actual equipment itself. The markings need to be legible, permanent, and actually present on the device. It can't just be on the packaging. And packaging or supplier claims or invoices on their own will never substitute the CSA markings. Okay, so now we're going to talk about high visibility apparel and red flags for that. So to start off, there should be a CSA label that's actually on either the tag or somewhere on the actual apparel. Sometimes what can happen is the counterfeiter can send you, I guess, a type of apparel that is actually not for the right class that you ordered. So that's something to be aware of. Sometimes the actual material of construction of the apparel can be faded or dirty, or it's just coming in a standard that just doesn't make sense, and it's making you hesitant. Oftentimes too, the actual reflective strips on the apparel can be poor or not meet the requirements of the standard as well. How to verify high visibility apparel. So really, to start off, you can take a look at the CSA standard that exists, and that's CSA Z96. You should take a look at the garments themselves and check to see that it's meeting the requirements of the CSA standard, that there's actually a label that's identifying or referencing the CSA standard, that it references a class or level where applicable, and that's matching with the intent of what you've actually ordered. There also needs to be care and maintenance information that's provided on the actual apparel itself. And yeah, you should be, again, cross-referencing. Any individual claims of it being high vis, reflective, or meet standards without there being, reference to the CSA standard, documentation to prove these claims, then, these should be red flags for the most part. Now, hand protection. So this one is also a very important one, especially since, hand protection can come in a lot of different shapes and forms. To start off, if there aren't any, safety ratings or labels or standards that the hand protection are meeting, especially for the hazard type that you're looking for, that can be a red flag. If the gloves themselves are made cheaply, or they're not durable, poor quality, they tear or rip easily, that can also be a red flag. If there's suspicious claims being made where, it's indicating that it can protect from every type of hazard under the sun without really any proof of documentation or it being tested against different parameters and being certified against different standards, that should be a red flag. And yeah, if there's no traceability, or you can't identify who the manufacturer is or was, or there's that information isn't forthcoming, or it's being safeguarded, then that should be looked at. So in terms of gloves, they don't all carry CSA certification markings like other personal protective equipment. Oftentimes, performance standards are still used to verify suitability. Oftentimes, verification can include looking at, as an example, if it's rated against a certain type of hazard like cut resistance, there might be specific ANSI standards or EN standards that they would be, I guess, compared against. And another thing that's important, especially if it's chemically rated, there should be chemical permeation and breakthrough data that's available. So the supplier should be able to provide you this type of information, or at least the manufacturer, in terms of them being able to source this information through them. Thermal or heat ratings might be important too in some situations, and obviously you would want to make sure that they're rated against appropriate standards related to that, similar to like what we've been talking about, electrical ratings as well in some cases. If there's claims being made that are independent of there being supporting performance data or documentation, then we should never automatically assume that that glove is protective just based on looking at it and it being intact. When it comes to safety footwear, again, you're kind of seeing some hopefully trends here with kind of different PPE. It starts off with there not being a CSA marking with, you know, either on the device itself or even within the actual area where you put your foot into. There could also be a wrong safety symbol either on, I guess, the outside of it, or it could be a mismatch between the hazard type the footwear's, you know, being used to protect against and what you actually required. Again, you could have poor quality footwear that's being provided. You know, let's say the toe cap is coming off, or it's unsecured, or it's worn out or damaged upon receipt. It's oversized, or it's not fitting properly based on what was described or what you had ordered. There's no CSA certification. Maybe there's reference to other standards, or there's no reference to any standards at all. So when it comes to foot protection, it should meet the requirements of CSA Z195. Verification should include checking that the footwear has a CSA approved certification patch that's actually affixed to the boot itself. And there should also be other probably patches depending on the level of protection that's required. So as an example, if you're working in an environment where there's static risk, there might be static dissipative certifications that need to be on the actual footwear, as well as obviously the CSA standard as well. Be careful when you see marketing claims such as work boot, industrial boot, or steel toe style, especially if you can't verify that there's these certification markings or the documentation that corresponds with that, including performance data in some cases. Okay, so I hope that was all valuable information. In these next series of slides, what we're going to kind of talk about is best practices and controls that hopefully can be used as, you know, methods of kind of controlling these types of risks. You know, these are some tips that we want to share overall. So to start off, we're going to look at supplier warning signs. So really, if we think about it, due diligence starts when you're actually looking at who you're going to procure the personal protective equipment from. So you'll quickly realize that the supplier risk can actually become worker risk. Supplier behavior can be an early indicator of counterfeit or non-compliant PPE. And really, employers need to exercise reasonable care when they're kind of looking at different suppliers, especially when you're looking at potentially sourcing safety critical equipment. We're going to look at some of these key warning signs, but before I jump into that, I just want to clarify that at the end of the day, whether we're looking at these parameters or some of the other parameters that I looked at or I talked about earlier, these are all risk indicators. On their own, you know, they can tell you something, but what it is actually telling you is that you need to just vet further. In isolation, these might not be proof of wrongdoing on their own. So what I mean by that is you should be using a weight of evidence approach, and you should be kind of taking this in different layers. When you have, let's say, that spider sense that's tingling, it just means that additional verification is needed and that you need to maybe check more documentation, or, you know, maybe there's certain things that need to be put into practice in more depth. It also tells us that our procurement decisions need to be a little bit more cautious. Now, when we talk about supplier warning signs, I know there's a whole list here. I'll try to maybe not go into too much depth. To be honest, I feel like this could be a whole course on its own in terms of, you know, talking about different levels of red flags related to suppliers. But in general, we'll start off with, you know, the first one here is you know, they're not an authorized or recognized distributor. So what does that mean? You know, you're kind of tracing them back, and you can't relate the product to what is actually being distributed or the manufacturer itself. So oftentimes maybe web pages will indicate whether someone's a recognized distributor, and you're procuring something that isn't on that list, as an example. That doesn't always happen, but that can be an example. You're dealing with the actual, you know, supplier, and there's a reluctance or delay in providing documentation. Their guard is up. They're not being transparent, and they're being defensive. There's vague or non-specific compliance claims made. You know, they're indicating that, yeah, you know what, this personal protective equipment that you're looking at buying, it meets every standard in the world, and, you know, you don't really need documentation. You don't need to worry about that. There could also be frequent product or model changes. So let's say you're procuring this material and every month or so that you're buying, I guess, replacements for it, there's a new model or the packaging keeps changing, or there's other types of excuses that are being made. That could be a red flag. The pricing is unrealistically low. So, they're advertising, you can buy 500,000 units for 1 cent. If it's too good to be true, chances are it is. Pressure tactics or urgency to purchase. So they're pressuring you. It's a limited time deal. You have to make sure, we're running out of stock. Please buy it right now. No physical business presence or verifiable contact information. So, at the end of the day, at some point when you're aiming to procure this stuff, there should be a person in the back end that you can have answer questions, or there should be some level of traceability to know where these packages are coming from. Poor understanding of PPE standards. So you have genuine questions related to, let's say, issues you're having with the personal protective equipment, but as an example, they're making excuses for giving you a response, or they're not actually able to answer questions that are genuine that you have. The documentation doesn't match the actual product that's been supplied. That can be another simple one. I think I've given some examples earlier about this. There's a refusal to support audits, inspections, or follow-up questions. So at the end of the day, there should be some level of transparency with your supplier or even the manufacturer if you're dealing with them directly. If there's nothing to hide and you have requirements or you just want to vet stuff, then there should be transparency. Like there's no harm in asking questions and just trying to make sure that the products that you're trying to procure are meeting the standard that they need to, especially given that you're trying to use these things to help workers. Suddenly new or recently created companies. So, I've actually experienced this outside of, I guess, purchasing personal protective equipment, but, there could be brand new companies that suddenly appear and, they're now advertising personal protective equipment. And, on face value, you want to give companies a chance, especially if they're new to the market or a small business or what have you. But you just want to make sure that, you're vetting them in other parameters too, to make sure that you're not potentially going to be taken advantage of. There's a mismatch between company description and products being sold. So as an example, the description, let's say on the company's website, is that they're a finance company, but suddenly they're selling personal protective equipment overnight. Again, those two things should warrant some type of suspicion. There's no reviews, there's poor reviews, or there's no independent feedback. So you have a company that, has been vetted or not vetted or what have you, and you have no other data to gauge on their quality of supplying materials that you're going to be ordering. These can be red flags, but again, you need to double check and look at other dimensions as well. Okay, so I hope there was some value in that. The next layer that we're going to take a look at is pre-purchase controls and some tips for due diligence that we can implement, hopefully. So we'll start off with pre-purchase verification. So really what this is looking at is we're doing checks and we're confirming, measures and processes before we actually order the personal protective equipment and we introduce it to the workplace. We have to realize that once it's purchased and we've actually distributed it to the workers themselves, that actually will become worker risk very quickly. And once we have it in place and it's in use, it might lead to, I guess, a bigger disruption and potentially a higher cost, whether that's direct costs or emotional costs or actual harm to workers. Verification after PPE is in use is too late. And really, if we, have this in place appropriately, we can mitigate a lot of the risk up front. Now, some tips for pre-purchase verification. To start off, the first question we need to ask ourselves is that, if we're going to actually buy this personal protective equipment, do we actually need it? Is there some type of risk or hazard that we're going to be using it to protect workers with? And we need to always remember that it needs to be matched and aligned to a risk assessment, as well as other controls that we have in place. We need to also make sure, or I guess verify, that the materials that we're going to be aiming to procure, we need to understand what standards do they need to meet and what regulatory or legal requirements do they need to meet as well. Before we buy it, we want to also make sure that it's meeting these requirements, and we want to verify that it has been certified, and that, again, I think it depends on the degree of the material that you're looking at, but that it meets certain testing requirements and parameters, and that if we need the documentation, we can cross-reference it and verify that. We should confirm that documentation matches the product being purchased itself. And we should also assess the supplier before we purchase it. So we want to make sure we do all our vetting up front and all of our homework up front as much as possible. We also want to make sure that there's ongoing availability from the supplier throughout the process, so that if we have questions, there's a level of collaboration that is being provided, as well as answers to questions you might have. You should also document all of this so it supports your pre-purchase decisions, as well as acts as a record towards due diligence. Okay, so now we'll talk about receiving and inspection controls, and we'll look at, again, tips for due diligence as it relates to this. So once we've actually received the material that we've ordered, we want to make sure that we have a checkpoint, I guess, when it's actually entered the building and it's in the workplace before we actually provide it to the workers. Even if PPE has been properly verified, there can be situations that arise when it's actually arriving to the workplace. So as an example, the wrong product can be delivered. Substitutions might be made without notice. The documentation that's been provided doesn't actually match the shipment, or damage or defects can occur. Once we issue that PPE to the worker, the deficiencies that, I guess, are identified from the shipment or the material itself can be more difficult to correct. So we can prevent that by safeguarding at this next step before it enters service. So what are some tips when you receive and inspect, I guess, the personal protective equipment? Before I jump into that, I just want to quickly clarify that this role specifically, it doesn't necessarily have to be a shipping and receiving person that's doing this. I mean, it can be, but it can be various stakeholders that are involved. And really, it can be anybody in the workplace, as long as they've been trained and they have the right level of competency to be able to, again, receive and inspect the PPE against certain standards. So the first thing you would want to do in a best practice state is confirm that the delivered personal protective equipment actually matches what was ordered. You then want to verify that the certification markings on the personal protective equipment itself match what you need and or what you intended in terms of the order, and that the documentation from the product is actually matching what you ordered and meeting the requirements of what you need. The next step would be to inspect the physical condition and build quality of the materials themselves. So it's looking at, again, is it built the way it's supposed to? Is it meeting the standards that I need? Is the packaging, as I would expect? Is the quality good overall? You should also watch for packaging and traceability issues. So you need to somehow there should be some way of tracing back where this material was shipped from, where it was sourced from, and if it actually somehow came from a manufacturer at some point. There should also be a documented process involved with all of this. And I also want to say that in different degrees, you might maybe emphasize certain parameters that are shown here at different times or in different levels. A simple example of what I mean is, in other places that I've worked previously, we used to routinely order, many different types of respirators and what have you. And sometimes it can be overwhelming to verify, I guess, every single piece or component of stuff that might come in bulk, but it is important to have some type of inspection procedure, and it should really be a shared responsibility amongst a whole bunch of different types of staff. Okay, so we'll talk, I want to quickly talk about controls too for substitutions and partial shipments. So this is a reality of something that can happen, right? So, if it happens, the key thing is that when you're aware and it's received, don't issue the substitute personal protective equipment without verifying it. You want to also make sure that the substitute meets the same standard in protection and that it is appropriate for the needs of the hazards that you have in place or the level of protection that you need for the workers. You want to also document approval before issuing it to the workers as well, so that, again, you have a record for due diligence. The reason this is important is that uncontrolled substitutions are sometimes a common pathway that fake personal protective equipment can enter use within the workplace. So again, all of this is to have safeguards in place and different checks and balances. Another best practice would be to segregate and or quarantine personal protective equipment before you issue it. So basically you're stopping its use before it enters the workplace, pending event verification for the most part. So some good or best practices include designating an area for the personal protective equipment awaiting the inspection, having clear identification that you have an area potentially for materials that have been approved and they've been verified versus those that have pending review. And then you want to also make sure you have procedures in place to prevent unverified personal protective equipment from being used. A simple example of this that I've seen in some workplaces is where, workers are bringing personal protective equipment from home to use in the workplace. It's not necessarily to say that, the personal protective equipment that they're using doesn't meet a standard or it isn't meeting a suitable standard, but it's more so the what if of that. And if there is a situation where it doesn't, that could be potentially, risky in terms of using that in the workplace. The goal of all of this would be to prevent temporary use or even, I guess, non-verified use of personal protective equipment. Okay, so the next step that we're going to look at is when we're actually issuing the personal protective equipment to the workers, and again, some due diligence that can be put in place in this situation as well. So before it actually reaches the worker, we want to make sure that we've done some type of verification process. We want to realize that once we're issuing the personal protective equipment to the person and they're using it, that is a control that we've put in place. And that is actually, the intent of it is to safeguard a person. So any deficiencies, whether it's not appropriate for the hazard or it's a counterfeit, it's a fake, that can translate to an effect directly on a person, and corrective and preventative actions after that, especially if you have an incident, can become more disruptive and costly. So really, in a nutshell, personal protective equipment should never be issued until verification has been done and there's been some type of readiness procedure that's been conducted. Some personal protective equipment will require supporting programs as well before issuance. So, we buy respirators as an example. There needs to be a respiratory protection program in place. That is a legal requirement. Another thing could be fit testing in terms of respirators. We want to make sure we're training and providing instruction to workers as well. We want to make sure that they understand why they're using the equipment and, the nature of the hazard and what have you. And we want to make sure that they also understand how to maintain and inspect the equipment itself too. Storage and replacement protocols are also a very important thing. And in places I've worked, this can sometimes be an overlooked aspect that is very important, especially when you have workplaces that work 24/7 shifts or off-hour shifts or what have you. People need to know where they can get replacements and the process for that. And, likewise, there needs to be a process in place that the equipment that's being provided in terms of the replacement is as equally protective as, the standards that we need in terms of legal requirements. If we issue personal protective equipment without these types of supportive, I guess, elements in place, it could create other types of compliance gaps. The other thing that's very important is to verify training and worker understanding. So aside from there being the potential for fake personal protective equipment, we want to make sure that staff understand why the personal protective equipment is required, what the hazards are that it protects against. In some cases, as a best practice, maybe you want to even include some type of brief information on how to recognize non-compliant or even fake personal protective equipment. How to wear and use it correctly is vital, its limitations, as well as when and how to report defects or concerns. At the end of the day, these are reasonable steps that should be taken, especially when we look at it from, I guess, preventing incidents, or even if an incident occurs, it's likely that regulators would look at compliance from this lens as well. Best practices when you're issuing personal protective equipment, really it should also be done in a controlled and documented manner. So some examples of kind of what can be done for the most part. You should be doing this in a controlled process. There shouldn't really be a self-serve pickup. You need to be recording what personal protective equipment was issued, to whom and when, and you should be linking this issuance to training or other requirements like fit testing. Part of the reason is for traceability purposes. Let's say an incident happens, you can quickly find that data that you need and, help to prevent further incidents from happening if other people potentially could be affected. It could also lead to, identifying trends with performance related to the equipment. Are you seeing a lot of failures with certain types of materials? Are you seeing issues with certain suppliers that you're buying from or what have you? And documentation at the end of the day also reinforces due diligence to help show that the product is meeting certain performance criteria. It's helping with replacements as needed or even trends and what have you. Okay, so the last line of defense that we're going to look at is when workers are actually using the personal protective equipment themselves, and what due diligence can be done when this is happening. So we have to remember that once personal protective equipment is issued and it's worn, especially if it's a fake PPE, then this is likely when the personal protective equipment will reveal itself as being fake. Sometimes, as with all the different layers and processes that might be in place, it's possible that, maybe it's possible that fake PPE gets through, and sometimes this will only reveal itself from actual real-world use. Typically, failures happen after it's worn or when testing is conducted or when certain parameters happen. Oftentimes, when you're doing certain types of testing, so think of fit testing, or you're inspecting hearing protection, or you're doing any types of inspections on personal protective equipment, that can often be a good entry point in identifying whether it is fake or counterfeit. The key thing is the staff would need to have some type of understanding on recognizing what certain types of red flags are for the most part. So, at the end of the day, visible deficiencies can be leading indicators on identifying if it is a counterfeit. So I kind of alluded to this, but again, formal testing or verification can also lead to, failures. But when this does happen, we need to have some type of action put in place if it does happen, right? So the first thing that can be done is removal of the suspect personal protective equipment from service. There should be some type of investigation that's done, and there should be verification of documentation and processes. At the end of the day, there needs to be a level of traceability to figure out the root causes of potentially why this happened. There needs to be consideration as potentially a factor, a confounding factor, that potentially maybe this is counterfeit or even a fake type of personal protective equipment. At the end of the day, documentation during use will also support due diligence. So record keeping, inspections of personal protective equipment, all of these things that we do, they can help support the weight of evidence showing the things that we're doing that are living and breathing in the workplace to protect workers and maintain that internal responsibility system. So more specifically, if we're recording failures and we're looking at trends and we're noticing reoccurring issues by models or suppliers, we can document action and take preventative steps that should be appropriate. The other thing that's important is to actually work with workers and supervisors, especially since they're at the front lines often, and they are the ones that oftentimes will be using the equipment, be testing it, or even inspecting it. So when we look at complaints about comfort or effectiveness, we should consider the possibility that it could be a fake. Again, you have to look at it holistically with other parameters as well. Sometimes, are you noticing that, or reports that PPE is being removed because it doesn't work, or there's reports that it feels different from previous suppliers. It's not the standard that we're used to in terms of the quality. In general, I would say that incident and complaint investigations matter a lot when it comes to counterfeit PPE, especially since, if you're not looking at, I guess, stuff beyond face value, you might be missing on root causes, and it's possibly a confounding variable or a contributing factor when you have incidents sometimes, especially if you have data that you can trace back and support that maybe there's a trend here of certain models failing versus, this, let's say a year ago, this wasn't really an issue, and maybe it's because we changed suppliers or manufacturers. What can you do when you're suspecting that there could be counterfeit personal protective equipment in the workplace? So again, it starts off with recognizing it as a possibility. And then when you're doing your investigation, it's potentially removing that suspected personal protective equipment from service, quarantining the stock, verifying the standards and the documentation against the products, as well as documentation that you have available from the supplier or your vetting processes or what have you. It's reviewing the supplier and the procurement records that are in place. It's assessing whether other workers might be affected as well. So you have this maybe isolated incident, but are there other staff that potentially are using similar equipment and similar models? And can we prevent a cascade effect of other incidents happening down the road? At the end of the day, it's very important that when you do any type of investigation or incident investigation, that you're documenting your findings and you're implementing corrective and preventative actions. I want to stress on the preventative actions. Oftentimes, especially in my experience from workplaces, we look at CAPAs or corrective and preventative actions only as corrective actions, and we often overlook the preventative side of it. And I think that's a really important thing. We don't want this continuing to happen in the future. Okay, so that's kind of those are the main components of the presentation that I have today. I just want to quickly touch on some key takeaways that I hope, you kind of look at from today's presentation. So first thing is we have to accept that fake or counterfeit PPE is a real and ongoing risk and problem in Ontario. Due diligence applies across the entire personal protective equipment life cycle. Documentation and certification must be verifiable. Inspections, testing, and real-world use reveal problems. Worker feedback is an early warning system. Incident and complaint investigations must consider PPE legitimacy, and prompt action can demonstrate due diligence. Okay, so I have a couple of other questions just to kind of tie it all together. So if you can, I'd appreciate it if you could use the chat to respond to the questions here. First question is, what challenges do you face verifying personal protective equipment? And then what controls work well in your workplace? We'll also have some time to answer questions. So I apologize if I wasn't answering them kind of ongoing, but I allotted time at the end. So I'll take a look at the chat as well. And yeah, I'll try my best to answer stuff. And if I'm not able to answer it today, I'll make sure that through some type of correspondence, we'll try our best to have your questions answered for the most part. Okay. Okay, so okay, perfect. Yeah, so good point. I see checking the CSA standard can be tricky sometimes because of access. And then for controls, it's buying from a reputable supplier. Yeah, so what I would say is, with all of these different measures that I spoke about, there's lots of different layers that can go into this. And it's not I would look at it as Rome wasn't built in a day, right? These are definitely feasible things that can be put into place, but it might take time to implement and or have people trained up so that everyone's working together to be doing this. I would also say that, these are good practices for just general things that you're looking to procure in overall. And again, it's just kind of doing stuff in a phased approach is what I believe in, for the most part. I see a comment here. I have a challenge sometimes with sending Canadian personal protective equipment to US or to other sites and vice versa. Yeah, that's a good point too. So the same type of, I guess, process could apply to other types of organizations that are found in other parts of the world where, maybe it meets the CSA standard, but maybe there's a European standard or an American standard it has to meet. And yeah, sometimes that can get a little bit tricky as well. Okay, perfect. So I appreciate the inputs. I'll also read through the comments in more depth in just a second as well, and also go through the questions. I'm just going to kind of touch on a couple of quick things I want to mention as well. So for those of you that aren't maybe familiar with WSPS as an organization, we are a non-for-profit, and we do a lot of stuff when it comes to health and safety in Ontario. We provide free resources, we provide consulting, we offer a lot of different types of training programs, and even things like Joint Health and Safety Committee training certifications. We're also a provider of the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, or WSIB's Health and Safety Excellence Program. And yeah, these are just references in terms of information that I used in the presentation. And we'll jump into questions. So, okay, so let's take a look here. Gonna take a look here for a second. Yep.
It's Jessica. I did put them in the chat for you as well. On
okay.
Your own chat. If you want, I can include them here as well, but that's up to you.
Sounds good. Okay. Yeah, this is actually very helpful. So I'll have this open here on the side, and then I'll just kind of go one by one. And then, yeah, if more questions come up, just feel free to ask away as natural. Okay, so I have the first question here. Are we seeing fake PPE using the registered trademarks of large safety equipment suppliers as well? I would say yes, for the most part. I'm not going to say that it's not happening. I see it with especially NIOSH approvals with like respirators. They might be putting the NIOSH approval actual stamp, like their logos, on the actual equipment. And it sometimes that can be off on its own too. I would say when it comes to counterfeits, there's degrees to this too. Some counterfeits are unfortunately much better than others at looking real than some other ones that are a little bit more nuanced. And I think, to be honest, a little bit too is with time, I think the equipment that these counterfeiters are using, they're just getting better at it, unfortunately. So I would say it's definitely possible. I think that at the end of the day, there will be parameters that something will act as a red flag to kind of catch this in terms of the layers of the different things that I spoke about. So as an example, let's say it looks like a genuine brand with the logo and what have you, but then you're looking at the filters and they're not fitting on the components of, let's say, a respirator. Or let's say, I don't know, let's say as an example, it's fall protection, and you're looking at it and it's got certain markings on it, but maybe the quality of it just doesn't feel or look appropriate for maybe what you're used to, or even from correspondence with maybe other colleagues or suppliers or what have you. Either way, this can be a tricky issue, and I think that at the end of the day, it's taking a step back and just being aware that this is a hazard, and inspecting stuff and testing stuff out before you actually put it into place. Another thing, and I didn't mention it in this presentation, something that I've used in organizations that I've worked at is when I was procuring new personal protective equipment, before I put it into place, I would get samples of it and do a trial. And part of the trial was, well, part of it could be used to vet it, to make sure it's not a counterfeit or what have you. But part of it too was to make sure that okay, on paper, people might be receptive to these different devices and what have you, and it might fit people or what have you. But before I fully commit to ordering a whole bunch of it, I want to get some real world information from staff so that, I'm getting a better idea of how they're receptive to it, or maybe I catch some type of red flag related to that. So I hope that that answers that question. Okay, I have another question here. It says, prescription safety glasses, local suppliers provide frames with Z87 marking. Is this acceptable? Do all prescription safety lenses have a manufacturer's mark that would identify the lens as a safety lens? This is a good question, and I guess it's a two-part question. So they should there should be some type of marking that references the CSA standard, right? And I would even try to take it a step above. And if you're really curious, ask if there's any supplier documentation, or even manufacturer, I would say. I guess it's the manufacturer if it's a supplier, to show that it was rated against a certain type of standard, as well as, the if there's any performance data available. These should be questions that, they should be able to respond to, because there has to be some type of paper trail showing where that mark came from. Now, when it comes to prescription safety lenses, it's actually a very good question, and I'm going to have to probably do a little bit more research on this myself. I actually wear prescription safety glasses, and I've actually been curious about this as well. But I would say that, there should be some type of documentation at a minimum that shows that it's rated towards the standard. I know that from like my experience, maybe I haven't caught it from using them, but I don't always recall there always being a marking related to the CSA standard. So I would kind of take a look at both sides to it, and I think that's important to at the very minimum, there should be some type of documentation in terms of traceability, if there isn't, I guess, a certification marking. Okay. The next question is, we use a supplier purchasing company to control the safety items we have vetted through purchasing in our safety committee. Tips for working through the third-party control. We use a supplier purchasing company to control the safety items we have vetted. I mean, I would just have a conversation, and if you're curious, I mean, it doesn't hurt to ask a question, and then you kind of just take it from there. If you're not sure about the third-party control, I mean, again, it depends on the organization or what have you, but some of the principles that I talked about today could apply to even third parties. Like if you're interested or you have a question, they should be able to answer it or provide some type of documentation. There should be some type of traceability to whatever their vetting process is or what have you. I would also say that, I think that on its own could be very important. And I mean, worst comes to worst, can you ask to perform an audit, or even, just have some type of verification of how their process works so that you have it for your own due diligence. It's not always common in every type of industry, but I mean, it's a question that can be asked. And I think if you're framing it from the right type of lens, right? Again, you're doing this for your legislative due diligence or what have you. I personally don't see an issue with asking that and having a process like that. Okay, so then we have another question. So here it says, my organization also has a procurement department who will simply process orders from our different locations. It makes it difficult to control/confirm items being ordered and sent to our different locations. I can't be everywhere to verify everything. Any suggestions on how to mitigate this kind of situation? Are you saying that all PPE should be sent to one location for someone to control before allowing shipments to go out to other locations? So what I would say is, like, this is a very realistic question, and this is often a very, this is a real issue that happens in the world overall. What I would say is, at the end of the day, this is where I look at management systems, and a system is never one person. So this is where, the different things I talked about today, while there will be people that are performing these types of actions or activities, it should never be the onus of one person. It should be multiple people, multiple departments, and really it's starting off with, problem solving and looking at, what are the things we need and creating maybe some type of like list, right? And then looking at the standards that they need to meet, and then who is going to do what in terms of different departments. And then from there, you move towards training up departments or what have you, and then letting them practice and doing these different procedures. And you kind of just umbrella it from there. I think that it's all about the internal responsibility system and shared ownership on these different types of systems and putting these different layers of controls at different levels, but then also looking at it in a phase control. One thing that's very important is when you manage any type of change, whether it's systems change or process change or even personal protective equipment changes, you want to make sure you're doing it in a phased-in approach where you're not potentially introducing an unintended hazard. So that's how I would respond to that. Okay. Then I have the last question here. So it says, hard hats. When should it be replaced if no other deficiencies are present? 3 years or 5 years? So what I would say is, I'm not a specific expert on different hard hats and materials related to that. But what I would do is I take a look at the CSA standard first, as well as any legislative requirements, and then take it from there. I would also, at a minimum, if those don't answer your questions, I would look at best practices and even consult the manufacturer themselves, like reach out to their, whoever the brand is, their personal protective equipment division, and get a gauge on what they recommend from, because they are the ones that manufacture it, right? But at the same time, at a minimum, you have to make sure it's complying with legal standards and then any best practice standards or what have you. Does the clock start ticking from the manufacturer date or from date of issuance to user? That's a really good question as well. I think that, this isn't really an easy question to answer. And I think part of it is, I would say part of it is definitely time. So it's from when it was made and it's how it's stored. That can definitely impact it. I would also say that date of use can be a factor. And this is not really a simple, I guess, answer to provide. But what I would do is, again, look at any legislative requirements that relate to it, then look at any standards that exist as well in terms of CSA standards or other types of standards. And then if that doesn't work, go back to the manufacturer, see what the manufacturer recommends from either documentation I would say documentation they have at a minimum, but then also reaching out to them and getting some type of answer to that as well, so that give or take the gauge on timelines. This can be an especially important issue even with other types of personal protective equipment. It's not the same thing, but a simple example would be with respirator cartridges, because they expire. There's often a date of manufacture. You might store them for like 5 years, but if the temperature or conditions affects it, it might actually, even though it was never used and it's in the packaging, it might be expired. So it's this is important to get the answer on. I definitely empathize with you on that. I honestly struggled with it in places I worked as well. And then the last part is it acceptable to put stickers on hard hats? So this is a good question. Again, I would go back to, legal requirements, CSA standards, and then what manufacturers are saying. From my experience, based on what I've been told in facilities that I've worked in, I've seen it as like something that you're not supposed to do, because supposedly it can impact the structure of the hard hat or what have you. What I would cling to in terms of getting the answer, again, if it's not answered in the legislation or even the standards and best practices, is reaching out to the manufacturer and getting input from them specifically, because at the end of the day, they are the ones that manufacture the device, and they are the ones that understand the parameters of the do's and don'ts related to compatibility with different materials. So that's how I would answer that. Okay, so thanks everybody. Thanks so much for everybody that attended. I hope I answered everybody's questions. Yeah, if there's other questions that have popped up or what have you, yeah, feel free to answer them. Or I'll try my best to answer them kind of offline in general. So thanks again.